Hi, this is Tim and Joel. Welcome to Midwest Hunting and Outdoors by Two Dumbasses, a podcast about the outdoors, hunting, and being a steward of the land. Welcome to Midwest Hunting and Outdoors with Two Dumbasses. We have a special guest today with us today, Kevin from the DNR. And but before we go into introductions, I think it'd be important to talk about Joel. Is we had some issues this week. We had some issues with our YouTube. We were trending very nicely in views. I think our second episode we were up to 100 views, and then all of a sudden we got a message from YouTube saying that we were in violation. So we've since rectified that. I think we're in good standing. But with that, I think it's also important that we discuss today and talk about, hey, where can people find our podcasts and our video casts? And so right now we are on Facebook under Midwest Hunting and Outdoors. People can find us there. We post some kind of dumbass moments and links to our videos, etc. We're also on YouTube, but then on the audio version of our podcasts, we are actually on 7 platforms. So pretty much just about everywhere you can find a podcast, you can find our show. So we really made some great progress there.
Stitcher?
Not on Stitcher just yet. We're waiting for approval from them, but we're signed up.
Okay.
Yep.
So, Apple,
Spotify. We are on Overcast. And there's
pretty much anywhere you can listen to a podcast, we're going to be on it.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right.
And soon to be Stitcher.
And also we're working on Instagram. Instagram's kind of a different thing for us because how you upload to that's basically off your phone, and we're trying to figure out how that fits into our niche and where we can share that. And I think as we start to get into some of our episodes and talk about how-tos and stuff that we've done, those will be great opportunities for us to engage in Instagram, and then we're also live on Twitter.
Cool. So I think the short of that, right, is Google Midwest Hunting and Outdoors, and you'll find us somewhere.
Yep. Cool. For sure. It's particularly if you're going to YouTube and do a search for us there. One other nice thing that we've done is we've got our new shirts. So I'll kind of show those to the camera, and we've got our logo in the back. And we give those to people who are all on our show. So Kevin Andersen, thank you for joining us. And then also, we're going to make these available on eBay. So we'll post a link on our Facebook page if you're interested in helping to support us. And really, we're not trying to make a ton of money. We're just trying to defray our costs with some of our equipment and stuff. So appreciate any support you have. But Kevin, thank you so much for
thanks, guys,
being on our podcast.
No problem.
Hey Tim, is it true that those shirts are good, but when you put them on, they become great?
Yeah, it feels great.
I
feel that.
Yeah. All right.
So with that, let's get on with our show. I'm really super excited to have Kevin Andersen here, and I think what I'd like to do is start off with Kevin. Why don't we do a quick intro and a little bit of bio so people understand your wealth of experience and knowledge that you're going to bring to our show today.
Okay. So you guys had talked to me about, where did I come from, where did I grow up and stuff like that. And I very humbly grew up in West Central Iowa on a close to 80-acre farm. It was my mom's parents' farm, Gerald and Bethel Goodwin. Learned a lot from them. They farmed, they had livestock of all kinds, crop ground. But the coolest thing about their farm, they had about 2 miles of the Middle Raccoon River running through it. And as a kid, I wanted to be down there all the time, fishing, learned how to trap as a kid down there, learned how to track animals. So was outdoors all the time. I tell people I grew up near Coon Rapids, which is about 1,000 people strong, And we were a mile from town, and I could have cared less. I didn't want to be in town. I wanted to be out there on the farm. My grandpa's farm also had some timber, oak hickory timber, above the Middle Raccoon. Pre-whitetail days, there weren't many whitetails back when I was a kid. It was cool to see one. So squirrel and rabbit hunting is what I did a lot. My dad trained Brittany Spaniels when I was a kid, so that was really cool. I learned some colorful language from my dad, God rest his soul, while he was training dogs. But it taught me a lot. When I started training my own dogs years later, I remembered a lot of the things he taught me. Went to school there at Coon Rapids, graduated from there, and went on to Iowa State for a year in fish and wildlife biology, what I'm doing now. And it didn't fit at the time. Young, rebellious, didn't quite work out at college, so I came back home and I worked for a seed company for about 7.5 years. And I remember I had my aha moment in the, I would say, the mid to late 80s, where I just said, I kind of promised my dad I'd go back to college. I promised my parents I'd go back, and I thought now's the time. So I saved up enough money and went back to a community college, Iowa Central up in Fort Dodge, got a law enforcement degree, and got my gen ed out of the way, which was really cool. I didn't know what I was going to do and where I was going to go, but former conservation officer back home, I went back and rode with him. I thought maybe going to the law enforcement side, and rode with him on some of his patrols, and kind of told him I was just going to quit after 2 years and go get a job. And he said, why don't you finish out? Why don't you go to a 4-year and get your degree in wildlife biology? And I said, you think it'll make a difference? And he goes, yeah, you've already got the law enforcement, now go finish up. And I really appreciate that. So went on and finished up at UNI, got my degree in natural history interpretation and biology, and then started working part-time jobs all over the great state of Iowa. Too many to list. I mean, literally all over the state. But county conservation boards, worked for Ducks Unlimited, the DNR, worked for the engineering bureau for a couple summers, which was invaluable. You think of a wildlife biologist working for the engineering bureau, and I learned a lot. I learned a lot about the inner workings, and that the engineers did care about wildlife, and worked for Fish and Wildlife for a while. So a very, very varied background, I would say. I got a lot of experience, and then ended up landing down here in southeast Iowa 20 years ago, and have not left. So
that's awesome.
Yep.
You brought up a couple things that actually raised a couple questions, but before I get to this one question, so what's your official title with Iowa State DNR?
I am a private lands wildlife biologist. Our private lands program consists of 4 biologists, myself and 3 others, and plus we have 4 technicians, private lands technicians that work alongside with the wildlife biologist, the private lands biologist, and we're co-located in NRCS offices. The private lands biologists are located in the area office. They administer to the counties in their area. My area, Area 3, I always forget it used to be Area 5, but now it's Area 3 because NRCS, the Natural Resources Conservation Service folks, have restructured. My coverage area is 24 counties, so it's pretty large. But we also have Pheasants Forever folks in our area, the Farm Bill biologists. I think, Joel, you and your wife have met Shane Weinberg.
Yeah.
And we also have Holly Shutt, she's kind of in the southeast part. And then the technician that works with myself is Jason Greach. So we're not a huge program, but we pretty much cover the whole state.
So with that, what's your role working with private landowners?
My role would be in the area office with NRCS is I help their field offices. It's a structured type system where each area has field offices. The field offices have their district conservationists and their soil conservationists and their technicians. My main goal is to go out and educate, teach. A lot of those folks have ag backgrounds. They may not have the wildlife background, but I also take a lot of cold calls. I think both of you guys were cold calls. A lot of word of mouth. Basically, if a landowner calls, such as yourselves, we set up a time and a place that works for you guys, hopefully at the farm. And then I come out and we look things over and find out what your goals and objectives are, what kind of wildlife you guys want to manage. And it could be anywhere from rabbits and squirrels to butterflies and bees to, hey, we just want to plant prairie and we love the way it looks. So it's all ends of the spectrum.
You know, thinking about that, Joel, you and I both had Kevin out to our properties, and we both had different types of visits. And I wouldn't say neither of them were wrong, but when I say different types of visits, Kevin came on the property, I think it was hot that day, and hey, let's hop on the ATV and drive around the property and show you what we've got and let's talk. And I think that was effective. But yours was different. How did you guys do yours?
Yeah, so I think, correct me if I'm wrong, Kevin, but you came out and we, kind of just a circular tour of the property on foot and walked through. And our main objective, talking with Kevin, was, how do we improve the habitat, generally speaking, of the farm, but to manage deer and turkey. And then I know my wife is into honeybees and those type of things. So pollinators and flowers and coverage was a big focus from her standpoint.
Right. So I guess to further that, it's all ends of the spectrum. I tell people after 20 years I've been on pretty much every mode of transportation, pickups, UTVs, ATVs. Was actually on the back of a mule, not a Kawasaki, an actual living mule with a farmer down in Van Buren County. Yeah, I know, you kind of laugh. Not been on a horse, but I've been on a mule. The guy used to coon hunt, and he took me out on his mule. He said, I don't walk well anymore, and hop on, and away we went. But a lot of times, like if someone has 200 acres or 2 acres, it doesn't matter. Some people want to hike and walk, and that's great. We do plan ID. Some people say, I've got an hour or two, Kevin. Can we hop on a UTV or an ATV and go look at things? Whatever's most efficient, whatever my customers usually want. I love getting out and hoofing. I mean, it was cold when we did it, when you and I and your wife did it, Joel. It was hot when we did it, Tim. So whatever works for my customers, I'm comfortable with all of it. So
Okay.
yeah.
So one other thing you brought up as you're talking about when you were a kid, and you talk about there were no whitetail around. And I know when we were hunting up at your property when we were younger, that your father would always say, hey, there's no whitetail around. Let's just talk real quickly about the progression of whitetail in the state of Iowa, and where we were at when the kids, and then through DNR efforts, really, how we've got to where we're at today.
Yeah, it's always interesting to me, I'll turn 58 next month, and I didn't start deer hunting until I was 16. And back then we had to fill out an application and send it in to the then Iowa Conservation Commission. You guys probably remember those days. It was very interesting. I grew up in Zone 2 over in Carroll County. I was right on the edge of Zone 4, which was basically southern Iowa. And I remember, when I was 16, it's a really cool story. I was at the state fair, the Iowa State Fair, with friends. And as a farm kid, you're like, this is cool. Cotton candy, corn dogs, you get away from the farm for a while.
This ain't Coon Rapids anymore.
This ain't Coon Rapids. This is Des Moines, right? This is the big city. But I remember distinctly walking through the building where the Iowa Conservation Commission was, and I'd saved up some of my money to take to the fair, and I think my folks handed me a $20 bill and say, don't spend it all at the fair, save some. And I remember walking through, and that was my first experience with meeting someone from the, Iowa Conservation Commission, or the DNR. It was a conservation officer working the booth, and he said, hey, do you deer hunt? I kind of gave him a look like, well, we don't have any deer where I live. And he said, well, where do you live? And we started this really cool conversation, and he convinced me to put some money in an envelope, and I just kept thinking my folks are going to kill me for doing this, right? And he took it. It was like the day that we needed to have that application for the license into Des Moines. And he said, I think it was $10 at the time. And he said, if you don't get drawn, you get your money back. And I was like, oh, well, okay. Farm kid, I'll go ahead and do it. And I had I didn't have any gear. We didn't have to wear blaze orange. So I remember getting home and telling my folks that I had done that. And my dad gave me that, that look where, the stern look like, well, a fool and his money are soon parted, right? I said, well, I'll get it back, Dad. But I remember getting drawn. I drew a tag, and it was a buck-only tag. And we had a 3-day shotgun season back then, not 5. And I remember hunting on my granddad's farm and asking relatives that did deer hunt, what do I need? What do I do? I had no clue. And I saw the same doe group of, it was 3 does and 2 fawns, those 3 days on my granddad's farm, and wishing antlers on their head. I was wishing for an antler to grow out of their head, and it didn't, but I remember that was 78. I was 16 in 1978, and it just progressively went up. And I'll never forget convincing my dad to go to Guthrie County and hunt on public land one year. Dad, we can maybe draw a doe tag. I really want to kill a deer. And it took me 7 years to kill my first deer with a shotgun. And I was a Johnny-come-lately with the bow. I didn't start bow hunting until, 94. I had a friend convince me, Kev, you got to go do this. You get more time in the tree. And I'm like, I don't have time. And then you say, you make time to bow hunt. You just make the time. But I remember seeing that progression of deer numbers going up, and we noticed it. We started seeing that when we were pheasant hunting. We'd be walking switchgrass fields with Brittany's and going, did you see that hawk pop up out of that switchgrass? And little did we know that they like to live out there, that they like to spend time out in the native grasses. So yeah, it's been a really cool thing, and just seeing the progression. And I love talking to the younger folks that are buying land now, and they don't, not being rude or mean, but they don't realize where we've come from. We came from hardly any deer to a wonderful population in the state. So
I mean, Kevin just expanded on that. I mean, today's day and age, it's not drawing for tags anymore. It's, hey, what counties have extra tags, right?
Exactly.
Exactly. It's a surplus of tags that go unpurchased every year.
Yeah. In certain counties, I think the further west and south we get, there's several counties that don't sell out.
So Kevin, next question I really have is, what are the steps? I'm a new landowner. I just bought some property, or for that matter, maybe if I'm an existing landowner, and I've decided, hey, I want to improve the land habitat for my property. It's either for me or for my kids or my grandkids, for that matter. Mm-hmm. What are the steps I would go in order to start determining what I need to do?
Usually what I do when usually it's a phone conversation, an email conversation. Somebody reaches out to me, I get a referral from somebody, and I usually try to reach out right away and say, hey, you bought a property, you've owned it for 20 years. What are your goals and objectives? Because if I can kind of zero in on folks' goals and objectives, a lot of folks, it's whitetail and turkey, or just plain whitetail. Then I kind of know what direction to head in, as far as we're going to take the tour of the farm. And if they've got woodlands, hey, have you had a consulting forester? Have you had an Iowa DNR forester, a district forester out here? And then we set up a time, a place, to meet, get to the farm. I always ask landowners if I can't get them, I'd love to have aerial photos, because it's a great place to start. Absolutely a great place to start, to look at the boundaries, to look at the composition of the land. A lot of times I can pull up LiDAR, which is everything's off the landscape on these maps, and you can see contours in the valleys, and you can actually see ponds. It reminds me of tinfoil on the land. If you've never seen it, it's pretty cool. It's been out for a while, but get there. Introductions, usually the stories flow. Somebody's got a nice deer hanging on the wall, or turkeys, like over there on the wall, and we just start visiting. And then we go to the field, whether it's on the UTV, the ATV, on foot, family members. Maybe it's just the guy that bought it and me. Sometimes I have new folks. Sometimes NRCS, the natural resources folks, are out with. Maybe it's a Pheasants Forever person. And we go out and we whether we put tires on the ground or whether we put boots on the ground, leather on the ground, we're walking. and we're looking, and I'm trying to figure out lots of different things. What does this person really want to do? Do they want to manage the timber? Do they want to plant some natives? Are they interested in programs, cost share programs, CRP, Conservation Reserve Program? There's just a myriad of programs out there. And then how do we get them there? That's the next step. If we're not doing cost share, great. Do you own a chainsaw? Are you comfortable using it, right? I always call it sweat equity, right? Are you willing to put some sweat equity in the land? If you're interested in cost share, then we need to get to the vendor of the cost share, whether that's natural resources, conservation service, whether that's the DNR in some of our programs. How do we get them to that point? I'm not pushy on programs, but I try to figure out right away what direction this landowner wants to go. One of the things I usually ask landowners is, do you want to do it yourself? If you want to do it yourself, then I'll write you a plan. I'll write the plan no matter what, but if they're going to do it themselves, I might write the plan a little bit differently. The last thing I ever want, because Joel and Samantha own this farm, and Tim and his wife own that farm, and the last thing I ever want is for a landowner to go, well, this DNR guy wrote me a 16-page plan, and it looks like I'm working for the next 16 years, and I don't have time to fish, hunt, trap, do all these wonderful things. So never overwhelm. I don't want to underwhelm, but I want to know what your top priority is. So,
you bring up a good point. I think of land improvement, and land improvement, wildlife habitat's certainly a big piece of that. It's a marathon. It's not a sprint.
Right.
And the other thing, I want to come back to programs here in a second. Mm-hmm. But land conservation isn't cheap.
No.
So whenever you want to do something, hey, if there's ways to where you can partner with somebody, I think that's what you want to do. I want to come back to programs, but you brought up another thing about maps. The importance of having a map of your property, I think, is absolutely pivotal, whether you're going to be hunting, wildlife habitat. We're at Joel's place right now, and we actually have a map, and a map on the property he's got of just an aerial map. He's got a topography map somewhere around here, and I can't say enough about how many times we go back to, hey, the deer's changed their paths. We pull out the maps and we start to try to figure out, hey, how are they moving, etc. Where's some pinch points? I just can't say enough about maps. You got anything to add to that?
No, I agree. This service that you provide, what's the cost associated to it?
With the Iowa DNR Private Lands Program, there is no cost. A lot of people ask. I think a lot of times you're a consultant or something like that. I am, but at zero charge to the landowner. I tell folks, if you buy a habitat stamp, if you buy a hunting license, a fishing license, a trapping license, if you buy tags, anything like that, you've basically paid for our service. So,
do you feel, Kevin, that everybody understands that how many, what free opportunities are for landowners out there?
It's surprising after 20 years. That's a great question, Joel. It's surprising after 20 years, the people that say, I didn't know your program existed. I think more and more people are becoming aware of it now. The word's kind of getting out there. And I think it's a lot of you folks, my customers, telling people, hey, you should really get, the Pheasants Forever biologist or the DNR private lands biologist out there and take a look. I hear that a lot. Such and such at the bow shop or such and such at the feed store, or Joel or Tim told me, hey, get a hold of this Kevin guy, or any number of other private landers in Iowa. So, yeah.
Yeah, and there's you write the plan up, which is awesome.
Yep.
And but you're not locked into that. That's totally a flexible thing, right? From a landowner standpoint, you can do some of it, all of it, or none of it.
Yeah, I've had landowners say, I always ask before and after, would you like a plan? And most people are like, yes, that sounds great. I've had landowners say, no. I've actually had landowners that I've worked with that said, we think we've done everything we can do here, which is refreshing. And sometimes you say, well, Is there a reason you wanted me to come out, or we just wanted to see if what we were doing was the right thing to do? That's refreshing to me. And I have people turn down cost share. You know, you'll mention it and they'll be like, no, I think we just want to do it on our own. Some people are not ready to sign a contract with the state or the federal government, which is okay as well.
Yep.
I have no problems with that.
I think that was one of the enlightenments for me, buying the land. I mean, I had no idea going into buying the land what available resources were out there and support and help.
Right.
That most of them are free.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know, you being a perfect example of that.
Exactly. Yeah.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
Hey, can we go back to the steps real quick?
Yeah.
So clear objectives going into the visit, and for the audience here, and I think to help us negotiate this podcast, let's focus on whitetail and turkey habitat. So I come to you, I say, hey, I'd really like to. I heard about you on this podcast. This great podcast called Midwest Hunting and Outdoors, and you know, I'd like to learn more about it. I'd really like to have you come out. I really want to, promote habitat for whitetail and turkey.
Right.
So what would you specifically in this walk? We won't take a mule. How about this? We're gonna walk, Kevin. No mules. I'm not a hoof person, so
I gotcha.
We're gonna walk. So we're gonna walk the property. What specifically are you looking for? For whitetail and turkey habitat.
I think I'd be remiss, and I never take my thunder away from my forestry friends. I appreciate them. They're going to say I'm just saying this, but I learn from them every time I go to the field. We all have our own disciplines, whether you're fisheries, wildlife, forestry, whatever. But one of the first things, I've probably already said this, but one of the first things I'll do for you or Tim or whoever has woods, have you had a forester here yet? Because I'm not a forester, but I've learned a ton from foresters, enough to, I'll say, masquerade as an amateur forester, because I love being in the woods. I try to learn as much as I can, but if they haven't, I'll give them their contact for their district forester. Jeremy Cochran, Ray Lane, Lisa Lauk, any of those folks that are in their district, and I have several foresters in my 24 counties, which is awesome. What I'm looking for as a wildlife biologist is, and I've learned this over the years, I'll say a rabid food plotter. I love doing it. I whether I fail, whether I succeed, I love to succeed. I fail just as much as I succeed, whatever consequences. But I love planting food plots for deer and turkey, for other wildlife. But I've learned this over the years in southern southeast Iowa, is if you have woodlands and you have browse in those woodlands, whether that be young shrubs, whether that be spring ephemerals, whether that be, young trees growing after you've done maybe timber stand improvement, there is more food in our woodlands, whether it's hard mass like acorns, whether it's soft mass like berries, raspberries, whatever, and just the sheer amount of vegetation in the woods. I focus on that when I go out with a landowner. I'm always trying to put eyes on the ground, and one of my favorite things to do is plant ID. Landowners challenge me on that all the time in a good way. Kevin, what's this? Kevin, what is this? What is this plant? And it keeps my mind going at almost 58, right? So I try to think my way through that, but not only am I looking at that browse, and I try to emphasize that to my customers that, yeah, you got 2 acres of food plot. That's awesome. I love my food plots. I'll give you all my templates. Run through some of the crazy things I've succeeded and failed with. But if we can do things in the woods, if we can let light in there, if we can let light hit the surface of that soil in the woods, we're going to grow more plants. We're going to feed more deer. We're going to make better bedding areas. We're going to make better fawning areas. We're going to make better nesting areas for the turkey, bugging and brooding areas for the turkey. So that would be one of the first things I look at. If you got woodlands, where are they at? I want the forester to write their plan, but from the wildlife standpoint, I want to say, is there more we can do in here? Do we need to do TSI, timber stand improvement? Do we need to, and this will hit home for Joel, do we need to run a fire through the woods? I write a lot of woodland forestry fire burn plans, prescribed burn plans, which is very cool. Our woodlands historically burned in Iowa, whether they were lit by lightning or lit by natives or whatever. So it's kind of a missing component. I don't start off with that because I think some people think of out west and candling 50-foot high pines and things like that. In Iowa, it's more of a, if you do it right, it's a tame fire. It's something that stays pretty close to the land. But I talk about that quite often as well. So yeah.
So you're really, what I took away from that is kind of the first visit, first focus is around some type of food source and like you said, bedding, food source, and
right,
it's all about food.
Yeah.
And we use the term browse gets thrown around, pretty liberally, right? So could you maybe for the audience define, when you say browse, what does that mean?
Like you say, it's a pretty broad term. If you're talking browse in a food plot, it could be green browse, it could be clovers, alfalfa, turnips, beets, rutabagas, things like that. When I think of browse in the woods or on the edge of the woods, I think about timber flowers. I think about forbs. Forbs is just another term for flowers that gets thrown around a lot as well. I think about, white-tailed deer need that in their diet. They need that browse. They need that woody component to they evolved with it, before. And this is one thing I like to, tell my customers, enlighten them, in other words, is 150 years ago, there was no corn, soybean, alfalfa, red clover, white clover. Those things didn't exist. So how did our deer exist? Hard mass, soft mass, and browse. We may have had up and down years with that type of system, and we probably did. If we can go back to that, nothing against food plots, because I've already told you guys I'm kind of a food plot junkie. I love them. But if we can manage that woodland, if we can manage even the grassland, and I'd be remiss if I didn't talk about prairies, because that's huge to me. I love my prairies. I love my CRP, but the edge is pretty cool as well.
So building on that a little bit and talking about browse, I got two things I'd like to. First off, when you were touring our property, we put in some wildflowers. Good for deer, not good for deer?
Absolutely good for deer. Good for deer.
How so?
I'll relate it to a story. You guys know I like to tell stories. Probably everybody that's met me knows.
Shocking.
Shocking. It's a shocker. About 4 or 5 years ago, we got this practice under CRP called CP42. And for the wildlifers, they'll know that's the pollinator practice, which is basically 3 times as many flowers as it is native grass. It was kind of the only game in town for a while under the CRP, the Conservation Reserve Program, through the Farm Service Agency and the NRCS folks. Most of my deer hunting customers and friends always think about native grasses. I do too. I think about tall native grasses, big blue, Indian, switch, those types of things. I think about short native grasses down here as well, your little blues, your side oats, things like that. But pollinator was the only game for a while. That was the only whole field practice that we could get people back in. Let's say you guys had 50 acres expiring of CRP, and you would normally want to put that in a tall grass practice, like a CP25, which is 5 native grasses and 10 flowers. Well, if that wasn't available and you wanted to be back in the program for wildlife, for the right thing to do on the farm for soil erosion or water quality or wildlife habitat, and you went in and you tried to sign up and you came away saying CP42 pollinator, there's not enough native grass in that for deer, right? And then if I go out to the farm and meet with you and you say, Kevin, what do you think of this pollinator practice? And usually it was kind of a furrowed brow and I don't know about this. And from personal experience on our Coon Rapids farm that I grew up on, and I was lucky enough to own for a few years, it was amazing to see white-tailed deer come out into those fields in the first 3 years and beyond and nibble on prairie flowers. And you kind of the wheels start spinning, maybe a little smoke coming out of the ears too. You're thinking, what's going on here? Well, think about it. They evolved in the woodlands, but they evolved in the prairies and the savannas. So deer will taste test a lot of things. They'll literally taste test. And as they're out in a prairie, moving about, having their fawns, doing their business, they nibble on prairie flowers. So when someone says to me, what do you think of this practice? What do you think about prairie flowers? The more the merrier, the more the better. And to finish that kind of long-winded story, a lot of my customers that were a little edgy and a little bit, I don't know, Kevin, I don't know if I want to do this. You go out and I get to do a lot of plant ID, and it helps me remember my plants because I'm not a plant expert, but I try to pride myself on remembering them every year, my prairie plants. Basically, year 1, year 2, year 3, you're going out and looking at it, doing a status review, seeing how that prairie's growing. Are we doing the right thing? Did we mow enough? Did we get it up and growing? And going back on some of the, I'll just say doubters, which I kind of had my doubts too. And going back out and seeing deer beds and seeing nibbling and seeing browsing on prairie flowers and then looking over at the landowner and his son and going, what do you think? And they're like, we did not think this would happen, and this is wonderful. So yes, anytime you can incorporate prairie flowers, prairie forbs, and they're pretty non-discriminatory. They'll browse on black-eyed Susan, they'll browse on prairie clovers, they'll browse on just about anything. Partridge peas, oh yeah.
You know, one last thing, and on this, you've mentioned to me, I know a lot about edge, and edge was kind of a foreign concept to me. I guess I never really kind of thought about it in the context you talked about. So, can you talk to me about edge, or to our listeners, what it is and why it's so darn important?
If you think about your farms, if you think about anybody's farm, a 40, a 60, an 80, 500 acres, we're lucky enough in southern Iowa to have brush and timber and CRP, farm fields. Anywhere there's an edge. I'll never forget one of the first biologists I met in southern Iowa. Coming from northern Iowa and western Iowa and working all over the state, we just didn't have the bobwhite quail. We had one covey of quail on my grandpa's farm. Once out of every 10 years, we were just a little too far north, and they didn't survive the winters. And when you'd hear a bobwhite whistle over in that part of the world, you were like, oh, this is awesome. But when I got down here, I met with some of the local biologists, and they said, you're going to find your wildlife down here on the edge. And that starts sticking in your brain. You're like, okay, on the timber edges, yeah, on the timber draws, yeah, on the edges of the interface between CRP and your timber. Oh, okay, kind of that brushy stuff, yeah. Bobwhite quail, they live there. White-tailed deer associate with the edge. Our predators associate with the edge. So when I get on a farm, what I like to do is, and one of my favorite practices, and I'd be derelict in my duties if I didn't talk about edge feathering today with you guys. Really neat practice, and it's cost shareable, which I really love. There's cost share for sportsmen and sportswomen to use this practice. Basically, and I just do my, for the listeners, I know it's going to be hard to tell, but I usually put one arm up vertical and one arm horizontal, and I always say, this is our timbered edge, something like this. And we've kind of got a lot of hard edges in southern Iowa. Used to kind of grade out back in the day, we'd have that shrubby edge. You'd have, dogwoods and brambles and berries and blackberries and things like that. And a lot of that component's missing because a lot of this land still is farmed. Or it's in CRP, and that edge is not quite the way it used to be. And with this practice of edge feathering, what we're doing is we're going along the edge of the woods, and we're selecting trees that may not be as valuable. We're certainly not selecting oaks and hickories and walnuts, but we may have a plethora of shingle oak. Maybe you have thousands of shingle oak on your edge, and they may be from shrubby size up to 10, 15 feet, maybe 6 inches in diameter. And you say, Kevin, would this be a good spot to edge feather? Absolutely. What we're actually doing when we're edge feathering and working on that edge is we're trying to the main thing is let that sunlight down and get on that edge and get another layer of habitat. Because we all know as deer hunters, it seems like the big buck will usually hang back, if he's coming out to a food plot, or he'll hang back on that edge until after dark. And then we know he's there, but we just can't see him. If we can kind of get him out on that brushy edge, we might get a chance to see him or harvest him. it's a great practice for turkeys. I've busted hen turkeys out walking with landowners in the spring, and they may have done their edge feathering in the winter. Literally have had field days where the landowner completed edge feathering in February or March. We're out there walking in April and bust coveys of quail or pairs of quail getting ready to do the dance in the spring. That edge is probably one of the more important things on most people's farm, and I like to address it when we're out walking or cruising around. Just, it's something that I love it. I love talking about the edge because that's where a lot of our critters associate.
So you like talking about it, and I've got a little more specific example. So let's stay on the topic of edge here for a little bit.
Yep.
So on my forest, there's 4 acres here that's a food plot, and then so it's food plot, and then what I consider forest after that. I don't have a real good edge on that. So it's populated with a lot of hickory, a lot of oaks. There's a few shrubs and brush in there, but what would you come in and recommend in your plan to change on that edge?
First thing I would look at is, and this is when a lot of people have heard about edge feathering, and I go out and meet with them. They're like, I want to edge feather. And I said, well, let's cruise along the edge. Let's walk along the edge. Let's ride along the edge and see what your species component is. What we have there. If it's white oak, black oak, red oak, shagbark, walnut, I'll say, guys, we should probably get Jeremy Cochran here or Ray Lane here, and let's do timber stand improvement instead of doing edge feathering. If it doesn't call for edge feathering and it calls for timber stand improvement, that type of practice, thinning, so we get better oak reproduction, get better logs if you're thinking about logging someday, then that's the direction we'll go. If we walked out here today when we were done and you said, what do you think of this edge, Kevin? And it just didn't have that component to edge feather, we wouldn't go in that direction. That's what's fun about working with our forestry brothers and sisters is, if they come in and they say, what do you think about edge feathering here? And I'll say, well, it looks like we have a lot of oaks and hickories and walnuts. Let's go in a different direction. But if it's red cedar, if it's
hackberry,
things that
multi-flower rose there.
Yeah, if we've got a lot of species, maybe elm, maybe I always go back to shingle oak. I love shingle oak. I didn't know what shingle oak was 20 years ago when I moved down here, and I quickly started liking it. It's not a good lumber tree, as the foresters tell me, but it's a wonderful acorn producer. It's in the black oak family, small like pin oak, and it almost produces every year.
Prolific.
Yeah, and there's a lot of it. So. So I would just see what the component was on that edge, and if it calls for edge feathering, we're going to knock it out. We're going to do it. And I always tell people the only way you can really not do edge feathering right is not cut enough. If you cut enough, if you're doing a lot of cutting, we're lucky in southern Iowa, southeast Iowa. We do have our drought years, but it's going to grow back. I've got a friend in Jefferson County that's done edge feathering 3 times in 20 years. So you can continue to do it. It's not like the trees are not going to grow back. So, and I don't usually treat them unless they're locust and, the landowner says, I really want to treat the weedier species. Maybe he's got some honeysuckle and autumn olive, some invasive stuff. Yeah. Yeah, I know.
Honeysuckle.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's one of
locust.
Yeah. So those kinds of trees we would probably treat. Those types of shrubs, the invasive stuff, we probably would treat with a herbicide. That's not going to hurt our oaks or hickories or walnuts. But I love working on the edge. I think that component right there, if you can get that shrubbery or component. I've seen remnant prairie. I've seen prairie that existed before we got here. You let that sunlight in and all of a sudden it pops. And a lot of times if it's a pasture area, if we've got brome, bluegrass, fescue, the non-native cool season grasses, and we do one Roundup herbicide application, usually before we do it, because I'll have that panicked call the next spring and a landowner will say, I cut all my edge feathering down last winter and I forgot to put the Roundup on. And I'm like, do you have a wand on your ATV? Just go in and just kind of spot spray around. The reason I like to do that is we can get some foxtail, we can get some ragweed, we can get probably some remnant prairie, probably some clovers, whatever. Is there something more beneficial than the cool season grass? So that's just another little
Interesting.
trick.
So I think this is a whole episode by itself.
Oh,
edge
yeah.
feathering, right?
Wow, yeah.
Just tee us up. So we are going to have Jeremy on a future podcast. So for the audience here, we'll be talking about forestry with one of the Iowa DNR foresters.
Right.
So that's something to look forward to, and I think there's going to be some good crossover in this conversation.
Absolutely, yeah.
Cool.
Yeah.
Thanks for listening or watching our show. We have some exciting topics and guests coming up.
We ask that you subscribe to our channel on YouTube and follow us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook.
We look forward to hearing your suggestions for topics.
Questions and comments. This is Two Dumbasses signing off. Until next time,
Be safe,
have fun, and get outdoors.